Again in studio. Some days in bigger studios and some days in smaller studios. This time in a really, really big studio. Not easy to understand all those studios and types. To understand different forms of commitment, but also to achieve some soft code, it is not easy in life. To understand different forms of 2013, it's also not easy, and how all kind of different of scripts did start in this simple world. The family of Word, of course, is poor, but each script was having different ISO, and of course there are also the code and different forms of possibility for the cure. But not all people in this world, also not leaders, did not decide to build the cure, but some decided to build the world without cure. Me in 2013 was actually not working a lot. I was working with HTML, which is very, very simple language to understand different forms of soft style, but also to understand different forms of the servers that are in this world, especially in California, but also those that are in Europe and all over America should understand the simple servers in California and the lawyers that can actually build the better law or the rights for those servers. If you want to store your entire gallery or the gallery of your company, you can actually store it on your own server or on California server. Of course, every image can have a price, but the price should not be too high. So the different forms of soft ledgers can actually process the different forms of transactions. If the transactions fail, of course you must need to repeat the process. If you understand better what happened in 2013, you'll also understand the standards and what would be better for this world or also for your city together with the code. To understand different forms, but also the different charts of artists, it's not easy. And also to build different forms of objects and different compiled language together with CSS forms. To understand the regular code, it's not easy, but also different forms of typing together with graphics. To sort all forms of directory of films, it's not easy in America, but also not easy in Europe. To understand different forms of scripts, but also standardization in life, it's not easy. To understand all those Adobe systems and different forms that can actually manage the picture quite well. You'll also understand that some people are more committed to the picture and graphics and some are not. To understand that picture also can navigate some programs, you'll also understand that JavaScript it's not everything. Sometimes you need the tools like picture, and that might be the most important part of your company or of your work. To understand the macro ends, the sense it's not easy, especially not easy with different forms of packing and soft different forms of history. To understand those loadings, but also simple forms of transactions sometimes take even year. If you think that you can accomplish transaction in few hours, that's extremely, extremely strange. And of course, you can use different forms of TIBCO, BOCOP, TimeTrade, but also Orange Lab, Zend. You can also even Google RainCo, AnimJ, CometD, DVR Embed GS, or even Simple Fast Messenger. Of course, you can also use General Interface or Grunt, Inter or Jet Toolkit. Of course, also the Open Record or OpenSUSE Web, Lucid Desktop or WebTide, Revin or Mozilla. If you understand all those programs, you'll see that those programs also in 2013 were not the most important. If you understand the simple forms of the web, but also how harmful all those cookies can be, you'll also understand that web is nothing good and you should actually ignore it also as a developer. To understand different forms of the card numbers is also not easy, but not easy to understand different forms of the web browsers. To understand different forms of accounts, it's not easy, but also the origins of the simple forms of the microants that actually include the code together with the ethics and not extreme soft forms. The micro and simple domain is actually the crypto protocol, and it's not related to extreme abusive internet forums. To understand different forms of damned soft, it's not easy because, of course, they also include some stocks and, of course, a lot of different cookies. To understand different forms of applications, it's not easy, but also a thousands of micro ants programs. To understand user as well, but also the picture that go along together with different forms of situation, it's not easy. But sometimes it's very important to be different than others and build more picture and not more tools. The tools do not help people if they do not support simple, elegant help, which is very, very important. Sometimes it is very important also to build the internet anonymity. With that, you can actually build better service for the users. For example, you can actually use different forms of Tor or Tinder, and some people even use TikTok. That's where you can actually post some health data or films. But of course, if company would exist, you could actually build a better presentation of your products. To understand networks, it's not easy, but also to understand that picture can become a real Jesus or Joseph or demon or angel. So if you understand that picture is very, very difficult, sometimes it is very, very difficult to understand different forms of the picture, especially the picture with soft, the picture with anyone famous, the picture with someone that is actually very, very known on different platforms. To understand different forms of life, it's not easy. In life, there are very, very complex forms, especially with soft. And people that think about soft, they should actually also think about simple programming language. The C class language, it's not easy, especially on low levels. There are many, many of C++ compilers, but also many of the systems together with programming. If you are building microants programs. To understand the shape, it's not easy, but it's already shown on some picture that are distributed around the world. The family of world software is not easy, but to be more standardized but also ethical, let's go back to 2013, because in 2013 the C++ in microants was not yet developed. To understand different forms of objects, it's also important, but also different forms of statics and how much trouble the other designs and objects can actually make. If we think that users in the world are plus, we could be terribly, terribly wrong. Every user in this world actually built a lot of minus. And maybe that's what the biggest companies in this world are actually very, very difficult to admit. It's hard to admit that you have clients that are making your minus, especially if you are building stocks. If you are also calculating different forms of minus that you can have with stocks, you'll figure it out that you can lose millions of dollars, especially on stocks. If you are combining the programming with stocks, the things become more complex. To understand New York Stock Exchange, it's also far, far away from easy. To understand different forms of life, it's not easy, but also to understand different forms of the code. The code is some sort of a system, but you should not abuse that system like some of biggest programmers did. Of course, the micro is 100% cure and it's not disease. The science might be very, very wrong about programming, but also very, very wrong about processing different forms of health. To understand different forms of source code of microints means that micro means cure. It cured the world. It's very important to know that science might never understand the software development. And to understand programming, maybe it's not that simple as a lot of people think. To understand different forms of requirements to build a good software, it's not easy, but also different forms of viewpoints and how to actually configure the systems or servers so your environment of the world can actually go a little bit better, also together with picture. To become expert in this world is not necessary. You can actually build very, very simple forms of science together with computer. To understand different forms of arguments, of different forms of public, you do not need to understand everything. You only need to understand the basic legal things and the code. Of course, the legal in America, but also the legal in Europe. To understand different forms of news wisely, you should actually understand different forms of profession, but also me and my book. The fiction in book it's not easy because sometimes actually represent the ethics. Ethics sometimes means how we are actually analyzing word. The word can be analyzed, especially with programs, with millions of different factors. The more complex the word become, the more the adults will never understand it. If you are expecting that adults are going to understand the word, probably you are wrong. That's almost the same like you would expect the science would understand micro. It will never understand. Like it was also shown in 2017 and 2018. To understand different forms of technology, but also how different forms of governments respect technology, you'll understand that technology might be the real knowledge, but sometimes it is more important to build simple forms of the world, but also simple forms of theory, not to do too much mess in politics. The politic skills do not improve the technology, but technology sometimes improve the politic skills. It's a big difference how different forms of engineers can actually build economy sometime to understand different forms of attributions from our C++, but also attributions from simple microends. It is very important to build better decisions, but also different forms of technique experts, especially when it comes to millions of different electronic elements. The technology in culture, it's very, very difficult. And if my book, everything is prohibited for the internet, that's the only way how there will be the safe, simple face yoga forums, the simple face different technology, the simple safe Twitter, the simple safe YouTube, the simple safe Instagram, and the simple safe Pinterest. The only way that my book is prohibited for the internet. To understand some people that are actually very, very positive about different forms of authors that might be completely wrong. They might only see their own economy or how they sometimes improve when they see someone political or someone that made a simple book. To understand different forms of the accounts, but also the politics, it's not easy. And all the different places in the world. To understand different forms of soft is not easy because there is so soft, but also your own voice, and not to repeat the political nonsense. To understand different forms of the possibility in this world, it's not easy. But sometimes it's also not easy to understand the most basic things. The most basic things include different forms of the theory. The theory is very important because with theory you'll also understand different forms of the chips. With different forms of the chips, you'll actually understand different forms of compiled language and circuits. Those are also different forms of ledgers. With better theory, you'll actually build better code in reality, but also integrate different forms of circuits much better. With better theory, you'll understand SOF and how safe it really is. To understand different forms of dominant forms in life, but also the type of domain, it's also important. And if you are going to understand that micro and microprocessors are very complex designs, you'll also understand that that's very technical thing and not science at all. To understand different forms of supercomputers, of course, that was on the picture of this simple film for $5 million. If you are not prepared to pay that amount, do not look this film. But sometimes it's also important to have some theory about what is actually to share something on the web or in this world. To control different forms of films or knowledge, it's very difficult in politics. And sometimes the regulators also fails by their ethics, like it happened in 2016. To understand better and better psychology in life, it's also important, but also psychology about different forms of theology, technology, or the theory of religion, and how something looks. To understand different forms of very complex domains migrants have, it's not easy, and what type of different office they represent. Sometimes it's very important to build diversity in life because diversity is actually the most important thing. How to build a healthy organization or the workplace for people. To understand the status in life, it's not easy, but it's also not easy to build the code that's going to serve everyone. If you want to build the code that's going to serve everyone, you should actually prohibit the code for some people. For women, the code usually means that they get something cheaper or some sort of bonus in their logistics or their life. So, the code for the woman or the code for the man might mean two different things. But if you are the coding expert, you might actually build better decisions in your life. With better code, you'll also design better system, but also maybe a better soft design that ever was designed. To understand different forms in life, it's not easy, but also very difficult decisions how to build some problems for social life. So they are going to think a little bit more about what is possible to build better in their emotions or their company or their work. To understand the code mechanisms, it's not easy, but also the emotional intelligence is very important when it comes to your partners or people that are actually working. That might mean a better elegance in their life. To understand different forms that also are correct or they are false, it's not easy in life. But if you are looking for stability, you should actually look more for simple forms of the picture and not so much the picture of the people. If you'll understand different forms of reliability, but also different forms of methods. In this world, you'll also understand that sometimes it's not easy to predict accuracy with the code. Sometimes you'll see in history that code is not everything, but you also must have ethics. So, ethics are a very important part of life. If you are going to build ethics, you are going to build a better life. And ethics means not fast process. To understand ethics, you'll also understand that ethics are currency. And the ethics might be the most important currency you have, not the servers only.